Right. Hopefully, you should all be. Do you all see the slides here?
Yes, we
Um,
can.
Well,
awesome. Oh, sorry. So, I'm Louis Viss. I'm a head of geography at Rillington Green School in Bristol. And I've been. I've got to know the no disaster. Disaster is not natural over the last few years as I taught the specification to our students. I was overhearing the presentation just before, and I'm going to come up from a very less academic background. Of I teach secondary school students from 11 years old to 18, but in essence, kind of what you guys do in the academia does trickle down, and I want to show you a few things we teach and a few things we do for various year groups within our school and across the country, really. So the first one is, for those who aren't in the UK system, we have three different what we call key stages. Key stage 3 is from year 7, 8, 9 to 11 years old to about 13, 14. Then we have key stage 4, which is 15, 16, where they do their GCSE, which is their first official qualification. And then they have key stage 5, which is your A level, and that's when they are 17, 18, and then the A levels then get them into universities later on. Key stage 3, we are given a A4 piece of paper from the government as a national curriculum we have to teach, and in it you've got some generic words like they have to learn about Asia, Africa, hazards. It's just incredibly vague. So we've got a lot of choices to what we teach. And we spend a lot of time thinking, what do we choose to teach? What do we choose not to teach? Because we can't teach everything. And so we've kind of broken our geography down into 6 key concepts, which we've illustrated with people to make it a little bit more easier for students to remember. So we've got place, systems, sustainability, globalization, risk, and inequality. And obviously, it won't surprise you that I'll be talking about the risky rare aspect of our course, which we teach at across every year. They do a topic per character. And in year 7, they do risky rare and they look at ice hazards. In year 8, they look at tectonic hazards. And in year 9, we look at human hazards. So that be that diseases like malaria, HIV/AIDS, COVID, when it would be appropriate to teach it, and we look at nuclear risks, etc. So that we kind of really look, we epitomize, try and look at the specific aspects of what makes a hazard risky, and how does a risk then can turn into a disaster. Key stage 4, little less freedom. We're very much given a script by the exam boards. We do AQA in my school, and the one thing I like to kind of highlight is the language used within the specifications. So this is what students have to learn. And in the language used on the exam board, AQA, you'll notice here that in the hazard unit, they need to learn the definition of a hazard, different types of hazard, and the factors affecting hazard risk. We then learned about tectonic theories, but we then deal into specific example of hazards. And in the tectonic aspects of hazard, we took short, primary, secondary effects, long-term response, immediate response to hazards. They have to use a named example of a low-income country and a high-income country. So we do L'Aquila in Italy and the Gorkha earthquake in Nepal. And then we look at ways in which we can reduce risk by looking at monitoring, prediction, protection, but no point in here or even in the weather hazards later in the spec. No point do they use the word disaster, natural disaster in the specification. And I think it's interesting that it's such a widespread term in the language and the discourse used by newspapers, the news, even you go on the BBC, you read about natural disasters, that the specification never tells us to teach natural disasters, yet a lot of people will, because of the way we're used to talking about these hazards and disasters in society, use those words in the classroom. And when I started teaching in 2016, I personally used the word natural disasters. I didn't quite understand how we could distinguish the disaster from the hazard. But if you really go into detail in the specification, it's interesting to see they never use the word natural disaster in it. And so one of the slides I show students, and I love showing that slide, is, okay, here's 2, volcano A, volcano B. Which one will lead is more likely to lead to disaster? And it's unanimous. I've never had a single child, even if they're trying to be funny, to put a hand up and go, sir, B is going to lead to a disaster. They all go A. And then we look at the implication. and we look at the implication of Naples next to Mount Vesuvius, etc. And we discussed, okay, well, why A? What's the risk? Why is this likely to lead to disaster and not B? Because in essence, it's the same hazard, the same potential risk. And that's when I introduced them to the concept of no natural hazards and saying, well, actually, there's a natural hazard, there's vulnerability, and when those overlap, we can end up with a natural we can end up with a disaster. And so I usually share this video which Ilan Kelman's made on YouTube about no such thing as a natural disaster, and it's a really good introduction to the concept. And I've read the Disaster by Choice books. I tend to sometimes, especially Key Stage 4 GCSE and Key Stage 5 A-level, I share the notes I made on Kindle of the book to really kind of epitomize, because the first time you tell them disasters aren't natural, they go, no, that's not true, sir. As soon as you show this slide, they sort of understand your point. And it's the same for Key Stage 5. So Key Stage 5, we do Edexcel exam board, which is a different exam board. And in inquiry question 2, for the physical geography aspect of the course, students need to learn about how tectonic hazards develop into a disaster. And so in there, they have to learn about the definition of a natural hazard. They're then down in 1.6, they have to learn about governance, understanding on the concept of vulnerability and resilience. And often there we talk about Japan, we talk about, we compare the Fukushima tsunami to the one in the Indian Ocean, and we look at why is Japanese society so resilient? What makes them so resilient? How does government come into play? In lower school, they learn about Haiti, and they always know how unstable Haiti is politically. And so we look at how the structure of a society can sometimes define the high likeliness of a disaster. So we do clarify a few terms like vulnerability, capacity to cope, a hazard and an event, and resilience, because they're all very technical terms that students might use but not necessarily fully understand. And one of the things we need to teach when we teach that lesson at A-level, we look at Degg's model of vulnerability and hazard, and saying, well, vulnerability, you can have a society that has low quality infrastructure, you can have a hazard. If they don't overlap, you won't end up in a disaster. If they do, it can lead to a disaster. So that could be from wind, floods, droughts, landslides, tsunamis, eruptions, earthquakes. And again, here I kind of signpost them towards in the A-level, I tend to signpost them towards the book and said, really be useful for you to read it. And I shared this with no disasters aren't natural Twitter account and Kevin last year. So this was the exam from July this year. A-level students, paper 1 is about physical geography, paper 2 is about human geography, paper 3 is a synoptic paper where they have to mix their governance and their superpowers and globalization knowledge to hazards, to coasts, to carbon and water. And this year's question, you open the paper, the first question for 4 marks was explain the difference between a hazard and a disaster. And then they looked at small island nations in the Caribbean specifically, and the whole paper was about, okay, why is an island in the Caribbean more vulnerable than a country like Japan? What are the different issues? And so you had different data tables, had to analyze from GDP point of view to distance to the closest evacuation center, etc. And it's just trying to help students understand different factors that can increase a country's vulnerability to a hazard. But I thought this question, 4-mark question, sort of really epitomizes the debate, the discussion we have with students about the difference between the two, because too often they arrive in geography and they assume it's the exact same thing. So I was actually really pleased to see that as a 4-mark question in the exam, and the students all came to see us and was like, "Sir, I know you've been banging on about it, and it was a question in our paper." They were actually quite chuffed at the fact we sort of predicted it. So all I want to show is basically, on a non-academic, in schools, it's very much a discourse we're trying to use more and more to make students understand that a lot of the disasters happen due to mistakes or failures of various stakeholders along the way. So yeah, I hope this helps to clarify what we do here in schools, and I'd look forward to hearing any of your questions. So I'll stop sharing, and if you've got anything or any questions to ask, please don't hesitate. There you go.